Now, Kenya aims to raise about $16.5 billion in taxes in the fiscal year starting in July. But the Finance Ministry is being criticised for submitting yet another overly optimistic spending plan. Parliament's Budgetary Office, in fact, is warning that if no comprehensive vaccination plan is implemented in the East African nation, future lockdowns may lead to significantly lower tax collection. Now, even excluding pension services from the equation, this is not the first time in Kenyan history when the country's forecast tax revenues are insufficient to even cover the cost of running public services at all levels of government. The East African nation will be spending over $10 billion just on servicing debt, domestic and foreign, in the fiscal year starting in July. Now, for years, the Finance Ministry has also consistently missed revenue estimates, usually by double digits, from July 2017 to last June. You can see the trend that's building up over there. So given this history, the revenue target in this budget at over $16.5 billion is seen by many analysts as being entirely unrealistic. As a share of GDP, income tax and value-added tax have in fact been consistently falling since 2013, and that's despite efforts to introduce new taxes over the years. So over the last 3 years, these new tax proposals have included a so-called Robin Hood tax that would have taken 0.05% of any transfers over $4,600, even if you're paying that money to pay your taxes. That proposal, however, was rejected. However, last year, legislators did approve two other taxes, the enactment of a digital services tax and a minimum tax, which, according to the Finance Ministry, was aimed at perennially loss-making firms. Now, the minimum tax, to be clear, is currently facing a legal challenge, but the DST is still in effect. A few hours ago, I spoke to Nikhil Hira. He's a director specializing in tax matters at Bowman's Law. I started our exploration on the uncertainty in Kenyan tax policy by asking him how they are advising client firms to deal with the minimum tax, depending on the outcome of that court case.
When you look at those orders, the judge did say that if I decide that it's fair to continue with minimum tax, then it's going backwards. So I guess one of the solutions is that if you think you're going to have to pay minimum tax, perhaps you should have just paid it as an installment to pay safe, and then that arrests penalties and interest. Now, the law is silent on whether you can pay installments or whether you have to pay minimum tax. The point is, I think what they're trying to say is you've got to pay something. Now, to my mind, minimum tax is prohibited because once you pay it, you don't get it back. And that cannot be a fair and equitable system where you're paying tax in advance, having no profits, but yet you pay the tax and you can't get it back. That just seems blatantly unfair to the taxpayer.
And that also leads me to another interesting argument that we've seen coming out of the Tax Appeals Tribunal not too long ago, the one about using overpayment of corporate income tax to essentially, or rather offsetting future obligations of CIT against overpayments of corporate income tax made in the past. And the argument there was that, look, as far as KRA is concerned, you cannot use them unless they give you permission to do so. And you have to do so within this 5-year window. I mean, it just seems like businesses are being faced with one roadblock after another, after another.
Oh, absolutely, Rama. I personally think the law is quite clear. If we have a self-assessment system and you are self-assessing yourself, then you should be allowed to offset taxes that you've paid in excess in the past against what is due now. And I think the tribunal ruling was pretty much along those lines. The point is that what KRA are insisting on is pay your current tax now and apply within this 5-year timeline, apply for the refund. Now, as we all know, and we saw this with VAT refunds, which thankfully has improved, but we saw how difficult it was for KRA and the Treasury to actually make those refunds.
And ultimately, though, looking at the fiscal position the Treasury has, those refunds are simply not going to come. I mean, if you're raising $15 billion in tax revenue, but your spending obligations are closer to $30 billion, I mean, VAT refunds are not going to be on the priority spending list.
Well, no, they're not. And I guess that's the pain the taxpayers are going to feel.
Indeed. I'd just like to follow up on that with respect to installment tax before getting to the DST. But given that a fair number of companies here do pay do pay their taxes rather on an installment basis, when CARE is having these arguments about being able to offset corporate income tax obligations, where does that leave firms that do pay installment taxes? Because it does seem to suggest that they would have to be very, very careful about assessing what their tax obligations are for this year based on what happened in the prior fiscal year.
Yes, look, you pay your installment taxes on one of two bases. You either take your whatever you paid in the prior year and gross it up 10% and then pay that as installments, or if you're pretty certain that the 110% of prior year is going to be higher than the current year, then you use the current year. Now, generally, we say to clients and to taxpayers, if you use the current year and you underestimate by more than 10%, you're subject to penalties and interest. So unless you're completely sure that your current year is going to be significantly lower than your prior year, you should opt for the prior year basis. Now, in a time when the economy is dipping, although we do expect in the rest of the year that it might pick up, but whilst it's dipping, that calculation of comparing current and prior is going to become that much more difficult.
Indeed. So DST, the Digital Services Tax, was introduced on services provided by non-resident firms here in January, applied at a rate of 1.5% on the transaction value. Have you seen any roadblocks in its implementation so far, or any minefields that have come up in that space?
Well, look, the whole concept it started with the concept of a digital marketplace, which came out in 2019. The roadblock, I think, to me is, well, what is the gross transaction value? What really is a digital marketplace? And this year, the finance bill expanded to say, whenever you're doing something on the internet, effectively, you're transacting on the internet, that it's in a digital marketplace and you're subject to the digital service tax. But what is the transaction value and who's to pay it? What happens if I'm sitting at home and downloading from an overseas website and pay? Who pays the digital service tax? That non-resident perhaps doesn't have a presence here. So there are still a number of things that need to be ironed out. The regulations do go some way towards dealing with that. But again, we're introducing laws which may or may not be right. But if we don't have what I would call the statement of operating practice on how it all should work in place, then the tax is never going to work. And it's just going to have to be reversed in the future. And you'll recall last year that the Parliamentary Budget Office actually said that our policy is just too short term. We do something in year one, we reverse it in year two. And if you look at that from an investor's point of view, while tax may not be high on his issues to look at when he decides to invest, certainty in tax certainly is high.